Coming up, we talk Nic Claxton. Is he ready to make a run for Defensive Player of the Year? And what areas of his game need to expand so that he can become the all-around player Brooklyn so desperately needs? We dive in, coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets. Every single day over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the bounce-back New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And let you know today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. With more props, odds, and lines than ever before, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sponsor of the NFL. And Doug, we're officially sponsoring Nic Claxton for Defensive Player of the Year. We're going to talk lines, the odds, players in front of him, and then just his role overall and what we expect to be the next step of his game this season.
Yeah, man, Claxton, made a push for this last year, at least beginning of the season, where I think at one point the highest he got was third in odds for Defensive Player of the Year. It ended up dropping. It actually dropped specifically in turn with the trade deadline, right? It helps to be on good teams. It helps to be on really, really good teams when you're going for Defensive Player of the Year. But like Cam Thomas that we talked about yesterday, we thought it'd be interesting to start looking through these end of the season awards as they stand just in terms of different markets and looking like, what is the path in this case for awards victory for different guys on the Nets, which I think there are when you can tell yourself about it. And honestly, with Claxton, we'll get into some of the stats and all the other stuff, but just remember last year at one point in the season, just to reiterate, he was third overall in DPOY odds, which is what, which you take as reflection of current attitudes about a player, right? So it ended up tailing off. He ultimately finished 9th in the award voting, but going into the season, no one had him in the top 10 in terms of that award overall for sure. He spiked it and got pretty high. And the question now is whether he can get there again. And like, what is the actual ceiling when you talk about his defense? Because I think ultimately that's what it comes down to, is like what the Nets actually have in Claxton when it comes to him as an overall defender.
Yeah, we'll get into where he is over on FanDuel, obviously the guys that are around him and how high these expectations needs to go. I guess if we want to drill down on, before we talk stats and other elements, you just said it there. Can he take the next level defensively specifically, not even the all-around game, because that's a compliment to him being able to stay on the court and be as effective as possible in his defensive role. To me, it is the switching defense and taking that to the next level in terms of being a stifling, shutdown, on-ball defender. We've been very complimentary, rightfully so, around the fact that you can take him out away from the basket. He can switch essentially 1 through 5. He can keep himself in front of the ball all the way to the rim. Know he's an elite rim protector. We know the things that he does. But I need to see him now probably be able to take on one of those switches, say with a 3, and get after him and force the issue, and probably start to talk about getting some steals and some breakups in that regard, rather than, as complimentary as it is, be someone who can keep that assignment in front of him, but you may still get your shot off. You may still be able to work out of that coverage, right? He's versatile right now. Now I need him to kind of be on ball. Talk about, can he be elite in that regard? Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, I don't know if that's like the exact thing I'm looking for in terms of like him making this overall ascension. I think he's basically there, frankly, right now with that. I think that if anything, he's probably underrated in terms of just what he is as an on-ball and off-ball defender. I think the Nets fans, we understand it to say that he's, because we watch this team switches everything for better or for worse. That's going to be a discussion about whether or not that should even be a core strategy all the way through all the time. We know the Nets under Vaughn have wanted to switch everything. Claxton has been a key component of that because he can basically switch 1 through 5 and hold up on these different sort of perimeter switches. I'm not sure I need to see. I know what you're saying. Can he be sort of like this eye-popping Like, so when you
Yes.
think, I think maybe what you're saying is like, when we peak Kawhi, right? Like peak Kawhi was like, hey, if you got pulled on the Kawhi, he was just kind of glove you up and it was over, right? You might as well pass. I guess maybe you're saying is like, can he reach that level? Yeah, I'm not really sure, but he's really, I mean, in terms of just like big defenders, he's probably the best among this group at that specific thing already, right? He's not on the same level as like on-ball defender of like Kawhi or whatever, but among the group of defensive bigs, I would probably say he's the best of that entire group at that specific thing, right? To get the switches. And I just wonder sometimes if it's not really like if the greater NBA landscape doesn't really recognize that, right? Like if he's still sort of climbing in terms of overall understanding that he can even do these things, which I think he basically can at this point.
You actually touched on a thing there. We talk about the on-ball defensive bigs. So there are these categories that don't exist nearly in the same way they used to in the NBA. But you mentioned something about that, the lockdown ability of a Kawhi Leonard. Now, to say that Nic Claxton needs to do something on that skill set and that size of player are a couple of different things. But that visual of the ball gets switched to Kevin Durant for the Thunder, and Nicholas Claxton gets anchored down in front of him and really up in his body with the ability to say, I'm right here in front of you. And there's not going to be a situation where I'm drawing fouls. There's not going to be a situation where this is just to be chippy and just to be an irritant. And that's not speaking limiting of what Nicholas Claxton can already do. But it probably is that. There's going to be these moments throughout the season, this upcoming year, where if you give me that, if I see that, then I'm going to say whatever we already think of him, the NBA at large is going to recognize, oh, Nicholas Claxton for stretches of games can be looked to not only to be a rim protector and not only to be this defensive player in and around the basket, but also stepping out and saying on those switches, you can back off and trust your assignment because I'm going to take maybe one of the best or second best players off of the offensive end of the floor with consistency.
Yeah, if anything, it's like what happens with him is like a little different. It's because like he gets something that gets those switches, but when the Nets insist on switching everything, it just means they have mismatches elsewhere. So then they just get out of the Claxton switch, and then he never really gets to put it on display, right? Because what happens, this mismatch in the switch becomes so egregious that it's just like, well, I don't even need to take this on. I'll put Dinwiddie in the post now, right? I'll body him in the post.
Past year, right? Where's Joe?
Exactly. Yeah, it's just like we'll go hunt these other guys out. We know you're going to switch everything. We'll hunt them out, and we're just going to avoid this. And I think to some degree that probably hurts Claxton's case, just because. Well, it helps him because I think there's an understanding that he's a great defender. It hurts him because he just doesn't get put in the situations a lot because teams would just pass it off, and that would be the kind of end of it. Because when you look at his overall. If you look at him as like if you use B-ball index, right? They use like for defensive LeBron, which is just a stat, there's a sort of a catch-all sort of metric to kind of see where you land in terms of like among your peers. Defensively, there's like a group of these guys who are just the total elite on-ball and off-ball bigs, and the group is for different reasons, but it's basically like him, Walker Kessler, Brook Lopez, Jaren Jackson Jr. Like that's the group, and then maybe we'll throw Anthony Davis in there too, right? And these are like the elite big defenders in the game. There's those four guys. And then you have other guys that can be that kind of that sort of exists around this territory. But like that's the group, at least according to B-ball index. And I think that actually passes the eye test too, right? It's like this is a group of these guys are absolutely elite, whether it's like sort of drop big kind of stuff, whether it's help big, if it's on ball, like switching guy like Claxton with some weak side shot blocking ability or elite weak side shot blocking ability. Like that's the group of guys. I just think that it's funny when I say that group, like all of those guys are they all, I guess Kessler's not, but the rest of them are like all above Claxton in terms of defensive player of the year odds, right? Because I think it's just more sort of understood that they're all better defenders, but then by certain metrics, Claxton exists right with that group. It's just like I think it's just like an interesting eye test kind of thing more than anything else.
And that's why coming up here in a second, not only will we get into the odds for defensive player of the year, but we'll also talk about what do the other players on the Brooklyn Nets roster need to do so that Nicholas Claxton can play to the highest possible level. We'll dive in on that in just a second.
All right, before we get to that, I'm going to tell you our friends over on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You got to snap into action for this NFL season. I mean, NFL Sundays on FanDuel. I'm just kind of living there, to be honest with you. You have to be there too. Right now, new customers are going to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. All you have to do for that is you have to place a $5 bet. $5 real money bet, $200 back in bonus bets. You're going to get that win or lose on that $5 bet, and you're just going to be able to use those 200 all over the site. They got everything: spreads, player props, over-unders, the aforementioned defensive player of the year odds with Nic Claxton at plus 2,000. We mentioned Cam Thomas's odds at plus 5,000 over there on our friends on FanDuel when it came to the sixth man of the year. And then plus, just forget about it when it comes to NFL. The player props are sliced and diced every single way you can imagine. And FanDuel's just got you completely covered when it comes to this. You go to FanDuel.com/locked-on. You kick off the NFL season with FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL.
Okay, so as we continue the conversation around Nicholas Claxton as Defensive Player of the Year opportunity, we remind you, get over to joinsubtext.com/lockedonnets where you can continue this great conversation. Don't forget, it's happening right now. The discussion around Sixth Man of the Year award winner, Cameron Thomas. Yeah, it's happening. We're continuing that discussion. So you go over and join. It's like getting into that great conversation with all your buddies, talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball, because that's what Doug and I need to do. We need to talk it, and we need to talk it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, free 14-day trial. Now, Nicholas Claxton. So I think you're right in a lot of ways about maybe just being able to showcase it. Some of these other names maybe come with that cachet of either having being a little more established, or you're playing on a market or on a team that is ascending or is viewed to be trending in a certain direction. I think to your point, we mentioned last year how Nicholas Claxton was ascending, but then everything falls apart with the superstars, and it's almost like a byproduct became, well, then nobody on this roster is as good as they were when the superstars were there. It was all inflated, and that's true usually for a lot of players in a lot of superstar situations. But Nicholas Claxton has always been this developing, consistently growing defensive player, and now when we go look over at the odds on FanDuel, he finds himself effectively tied for 7th, 10th listed here, just behind Brook Lopez and Joel Embiid, though. They're both at plus 2,000 there. And then moving up the list with Draymond Green, Rudy Gobert, Bam Adebayo, Anthony Davis, Giannis, Mobley, and Triple J leading the odds here. Does this feel, how many guys, Doug, just like when we talked about Cam Thomas, how many guys can we clear out of the way here for injury? They're going to take a dip here in their play. I want to get Nicholas Claxton like top 6, top 5.
Yeah, unfortunately, unlike Cam Thomas yesterday, it is harder. It is harder to clear off these guys, I think, one by one. I think with Cam, we saw that we could tell ourselves pretty nice stories around why you could exit guys. Now, I think that same logic would vault other guys we hadn't thought about into the running probably at some point. So that kind of works both ways. With this one, it's tougher. The biggest knock, honestly, on Claxton for this award right now actually has little to do with the skill and more to do with the Nets as a team. I think that unfortunately is probably where he gets hurt the most. And again, go back to what we said in the top here. It was exactly what happened last year. Like exactly what happened had actually nothing to do with Nic Claxton and had everything to do with the team. When Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are on the team is high profile and they're a championship contender, and he's out there in a bunch of just nationally televised games. He's got a bunch of highlight blocks. Like he's a perfect complement to what those two guys could do on the court, and the team was really good. Nothing about him changed at all at the trade deadline, except that those two dudes left, and now all of a sudden the team was way worse across the board. And it was like, it's just not that exciting anymore. Because if you look at, literally it's the only difference. There's no other difference. Because if you look at his stats at the end of the year, it wasn't like things dropped off for him. It was just that the team dropped off, right? Blocks per game, second. Blocks overall, second, right? Like defensive box plus minus, 7th, behind guys that just weren't going to really qualify and that probably weren't going to end up playing enough games anyway. Like, so it's not like really much changed about him. The problem with that list of all those guys that you mentioned above him is they all just play on teams that are just way better than the Nets. And unfortunately, with Defensive Player of the Year, your team, you have to be, unless you're Rudy Gobert, like you need to basically have like a pretty good offensive season to just kind of be noticed for starters. And then 2, your team just has to be good. And I'm just concerned with the Nets here with Claxton that actually will be the biggest knock on him is that the team is just not going to be anywhere near as good as, Triple J, who's already elite with Memphis, obviously Mobley. I don't have to go with all the guys, but like all these guys are on playoff teams. He's actually the only guy except for Walker Kessler, and I guess Wembanyama right below him, that wouldn't be in the playoff picture probably. And that's just a testament to how good these guys are. But you can't put them all the way to the top because the teams just aren't good enough.
And one of the guys, I think the only guy that I would look at on this list, and I would say, which maybe is going to seem odd, but like Rudy Gobert would be the guy based on team and based on what he is as a player, like a very defensively focused individual. That would be the guy that I actually think like Nic Claxton should be, whichever way you want to move it, Nic Claxton up or Rudy Gobert down. They should be kind of 1A and 1B when I think about what their impact is, the team that they play on, what is it going to look like in the Western Conference, obviously for Gobert with the Wolves. Like, I see that as, a little bit of name cachet is clearly put on Rudy Gobert for what he has been. Well-deserved, right? And Claxton's going to have to work a little bit harder to get into that category.
And by the way, with Gobert too, like just like total fatigue around that too. Like he won a bunch of years and now it's kind of like, all right, we're done with this. It's the same guy. He did have a drop off last year in terms of just like box plus minus defensively, but I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying that like at some point too, you just get fatigued. You're like, we just did this a million times. Like he never got any better. He's the same guy. Okay, do we need to keep voting for this guy defensive player of the year, even if it was right? I do think that kind of stuff matters.
I was gonna say, because then let's like just to triple down here on this list. I'd say it's Triple J, Evan Mobley, and then you can pretty much go past all the other guys who've won this award, who are the maybe a little bit fatigue factor around them, and then you would jump past. That's why like Walker Kessler or Wembanyama, right, coming in as a rookie at plus 2,500. Like that's the jump through all the other guys that have already kind of checked this box for themselves. But it's why probably a guy like Triple J, who is well established in that role coming into the season, seems like the fun, easy, sexy pick to do because he's a younger player. He's the ascending talent in that role. Whereas a guy like, is Draymond Green? Draymond Green's always been a high-level defensive player. We're going to go ahead and talk about him again, in the defensive player of the year kind of role. When we then turn our attention here over to what is this going to look like on court for the Brooklyn Nets? And what does Nic Claxton need from the players around him in order to be as successful as possible on the defensive end? You did mention one thing there, though, quickly, let's touch on. The offensive game, when we're talking about defensive player of the year, that is something that Nic Claxton can control for himself, right? I don't think that the rim running, rim running and getting attacking at the rim will be enough. It looks great. It's phenomenal. And he's demonstrative when he gets those opportunities. But we need to see that next step for his offensive game, the little turnaround jumper, right? Something that expands away from the basket just enough so that you don't think of him, whether we view it this way or the league does, as a guy that is solely defensive valuable. He has to do enough on that offensive end, whatever that's going to look like, to say you're a consistent, 8 to 10 point scorer to go along with the elite defensive performances. That probably moves the needle here in terms of being able to get elevated into this category.
Yeah, like it kind of in some ways happened with Triple J last year, right? He played, he stayed a little less foul trouble for him. So the minutes crept up by more than a minute, right? He shot better from three. So the points went from 16 a game to almost 19, right? Like he had these little incremental kind of things that happened, which kind of helped tell you the whole narrative. I think with Claxton, that's going to be tougher. I mean, remember, like this guy was basically, I think he was first in field goal percentage last year. It was something like that. Yeah, first overall field goal percentage. Now they're all dunks, right? So it's like it's easier to make all your shots when every single time you're dunking. I agree with you though. That other part of the game has to change a little for you to enter the conversation because it just feels better. Right. It just feels nicer when you're a voter and you're like, oh, the guy's just overall improved. And now all of a sudden I can feel better about voting for him because it's sort of like he doesn't, again, need to, it's all about narrative, right? To some degree, like he doesn't need to be so much better defensively, but when all of a sudden the offensive stuff just looks better, you feel better about the vote. I'm fully convinced that's part of the case here. And it's not totally fair, but it's just kind of the way the award works.
And that's why, coming up here in a second, let's talk about not only highlighting where Nic Claxton has come in terms of games and minutes played over the past 4 seasons, but what does Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, and the rest of the offensive supporting cast need to do so that Nic Claxton can elevate his game and get into that conversation for DPOY? Coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at Jase Medical. Look, when it comes to medical stuff, the last thing you want to do is wait for something if you really, really need it. You want to get out there. You want to have the medicine that you need in emergency situations. You don't want to be inconvenienced with trying to get into a doctor's office, trying to get an appointment, trying to just get the prescription you need when you kind of know what it is that you need to take care of. Jase Medical has figured this out. Their Jase case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. All it takes to get a Jase case, you just fill out a simple online form. Some cases, you just jump on a quick call with the board-certified physicians that they have right there, and you're going to get what you need. This place is doctor-created, doctor-recommended, and they're going to get you what you need in a timely fashion. I've been through this, right? Like we talked about this before, but we had a full family case of the strep throat going on here. It was a disaster trying to get into doctor's offices. It was a disaster trying to get the prescriptions that we knew we needed. Jase case solved the whole thing for us. They're going to be able to solve it for you too. You can save more than $360 getting life-saving antibiotics with Jase Medical. Plus, you're going to get an additional $20 off by using the code LOCKEDON at checkout on jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, code locked on.
All right, so as we wrap up our discussion around Nic Claxton, chance to be Defensive Player of the Year, and maybe just chance to take his game to an additional new level. Always a reminder that Doug and I love to do when it comes to Nic Claxton. Came into the league, and he played 15 games, then 32 games, then 47 games, and this past year, 76 games. Minutes, 12.5, 18.6, 20.7, and 29.9 this past year. We are still now, I think also the way that we can think about Claxton taking the next big step is him being ready for that level of 30-plus minute workload. There's no substitute for doing it over 70, 76 games, right? You can't simulate that level of grind. So the fact that he now this past season did that and on the back end of the year continued to see a big role and maintained that level that we wanted to see from him after Kevin Durant and after Kyrie Irving, now he can go back out and I actually think probably be arguably more effective, more efficient, and certainly not maybe suffer some from fatigue factor, which early in the year we saw. By the end of the year, I think he was fine and he was starting to acclimate, but he was not full steam ready for 30-minute shifts from game 1 of last season.
Yeah, this has been sort of a natural progression. We've talked about this a bunch when it comes to Claxton, that it's sometimes hard to think about it this way because it seems like he's been on the team for way longer than he actually had. It seems like he's been around more than he's actually played, which is true, right? Because he's had so many things that just sort of got in the way for him early on. Illnesses, injuries, like there was a random stuff that just kind of happened that sort of, I don't want to say it stunted the growth, but it just made it so that he really last year was year 4, but it was like year 2 in terms of overall minutes. And we saw just such a massive jump for him just in that, just like on-court time, confidence, like just everything got better. Everything got better for him. And I do think this stuff's not always linear in terms of overall progression. Like it's not always this 1-to-1 curve that goes up the graph. And it's just like you have play more in the league and therefore you get better, right? Like there can be stagnation here. But because what we knew about him coming out of college and what we've seen just in terms of work ethic and just overall energy and the stuff that sort of seem, I would say, call it the commitment to get better, like the commitment to try to, change things at the free throw line, like try to just do things that are going to make him better players. These like little things that show up that just show you there's a commitment to like being the best version of player. It sounds like every player should have that. We know it clearly is not the case. So the fact that it is the case for him, you shouldn't get bonus points for doing it, but you can sure get bonus points taken away for not doing it. And I think we've seen that with more players we've seen that with lots of players over the years. With Claxton, I just feel like that progression for him is still there in terms of like getting better. And I do think that with like, let's say Simmons back in the lineup and like a full commitment to like really getting after on defense, because they're going to need to, the defense could be really good. And if the defense is just like a really good defense for the course of a year, that will make up for the things that we mentioned as being problems earlier on around narratives, right? Like if this team can get to like top 10 defense, and it relies a lot on Simmons, but if they can get to, top 10 defense, which I think is doable, like that changes the narrative. Last year after the trade deadline, they were 15th overall in defensive rating. Like, is it crazy to think they get a little better here with middle work cohesiveness? I mean, these are I've said a couple different things here, but these are the little things that need to happen between his overall growth and just like sort of the team clicking on this end.
Yeah, because he gets to be that anchor of it. And a couple of things you touched on there, the free throw shooting, the commitment to getting better. And I agree with you, right? You assume everybody does, but not everybody does. Like we know that. That's just true about human beings. Not everybody is going to do the thing you assume is the natural progression of how you get better. If he can find a way, I think, to get better at the free throw line, that's going to change it too, because now you're punishing teams when they foul you on the offensive end. Defensively, you highlight as we get into the rotations and kind of the roster for the Brooklyn Nets now, there's two questions that come to mind. Obviously, the consistency and reliability that Ben Simmons would provide Nicholas Claxton with would be night and day relative to other players that maybe he'd have to lean on if we're going to talk about getting bigger and having another versatile player that could pick up the biggest man, pick up the five, the center at times for the opposition. That's going to, as we were highlighting before, keep that switch and that versatility and getting onto a different matchup for Nicholas Claxton. Guess what? Now you're stuck with it. You don't just get to go away from it. And when you go in and look at some of the combinations, there's a couple of things I want to touch on here. It goes both defensively and offensively. It should be really interesting to me that when you go and look at the Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, Claxton, Dorian Finney-Smith, and Spencer Dinwiddie lineup, that was 328 minutes, and they played to a 115-110 split offensive to defensive. So positive. But we don't expect necessarily that Dorian Finney-Smith is going to be plugged into this starting lineup, especially if Ben Simmons is coming back into the fold. We wonder about Spencer Dinwiddie and what that could potentially look like. And when you roll through some of these combinations, do you agree that the combos I'm most curious about are actually not the starting lineup, where I think we have expectations clearly for Bridges and Johnson, etc., but it's about whether or not Nicholas Claxton might get tagged as the first guy to come out of the rotation? Early in the year, it could be Ben Simmons. But then what about the second unit? How do we find cohesion where if Nicholas Claxton is not playing with the best offensive players, you still create a lineup that allows him to thrive? Do you have any concern level around that? Because that's where my eye goes, is like, who are the dudes that give him complementary pieces when it's not Ben Simmons, when it's not Mikal Bridges, when it's not Cameron Johnson? Like, this second unit matters a lot for Brooklyn, and Claxton has the versatility to help anchor both units for stretches when needed.
Yeah, I'm not sure they have the right personnel for him, honestly. They probably just don't. That, right? They probably just don't. I mean, I think defensively they do, in the sense that, like, if they're gonna a lot of these different combinations, if you're trying to switch everything, like, that is good for him, right? There's where you're not going to get totally punished. Like, if you start Simmons, like Simmons, Cam, Mikal, Claxton, and then, fill in someone else, there's really not a ton of ways to, like, there's not a ton of outs in terms of switching. I think the problem the Nets will have is, one, they don't have a lot of complementary pieces when it comes to his skill set. Like, let's say on ball pick and roll, right? Like, trying getting to the basket kind of stuff, lob threat guys. Like, they don't really have that they don't have a guy like Harden. Harden was perfect for this. But so I do worry about Claxton from that point of view. And honestly, the other thing I really worry about for them is that I think the defense has significant upside here. The offense I see has pretty limited upside, and sometimes offense begets defense, because when you're just not making baskets, you're caught in transition. It's just harder to be good on defense when you're not set. This is why one of the reasons Golden State was so good on defense for a lot of years. They had great personnel and they made everything. So right. They would make every shot and they would always get to reset, because they'd always just be able to have the best version of their defensive just alignments already set up. I do worry the Nets are going to struggle on that part. That from that standpoint is that while they're going to have really good personnel for this, the offense could actually have the defense struggle, because they're just going to get caught in too many disadvantageous situations. So I don't know. It's not a great answer. I do worry about this, though. I don't think they have a lot of guys in this roster that are complimentary for Claxton, unfortunately.
And that's why for both, and this will be my closing thoughts, for both Ben Simmons and Nicholas Claxton, because they're in the similar mold of the offense is a question mark away from the basket, and then the defense can be elite. It's why when you think back just down to the back end guys, the Baisleys and the Watfords of the world, and we talk about training camp coming up, one of these guys working out, one of these players being able to become a contributor because they have some outside shooting ability, that can change the dynamic of what the second unit and these blended rotations are going to look like. The other thing that I looked at, because we love to tie things back together, Doug, 6th Man of the Year candidate, Cam Thomas. When you go and look, now I did this the smart way. First, I looked it up by taking away Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson and, Spencer Dinwiddie, and said, hey, how does Cam Thomas, Nicholas Claxton play? And the sample size was good. And they had a positive net offensive rating over their defensive rating. Then I did the hard math of take away Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving because we have a weird sample size from last year. But here's actually something that's nice to think about. When Nicholas Claxton, when Cam Thomas were on the floor without Durant, without Irving, without Bridges, it's 165 minutes. Now, the net rating is negative, but it's a 110, which is low, but a 113 offensive rating. And this is when you start to get into the weeds about the Royce O'Neals of the world, the Dorian Finney-Smiths, and still needing another offensive player. But the fact that these two guys could coexist, and the fact you've mentioned him before, Cam Thomas, with Ben Simmons and that benefit that it could bring, that may be the offensive next step for Nicholas Claxton, is seeing, identifying, drawing attention, and being able to distribute out to a Cam Thomas. Cam Thomas could be the great unlocker as you blend into the second unit and say, we still have the offensive firepower to be able to allow Claxton to thrive in the role that he has as he goes forward. So all eyes end up becoming around some very young players. And if they get that consistency and that next level to their game, we could be talking about a different kind of association here, knowing that there's a lot of guys here that we need to talk about in the week ahead and weeks ahead of training camp.
Yeah, that's what we're looking at, just like sort of some individual outcomes for some of these guys as your best case scenarios, maybe some worst case scenarios too. So there's still tons to dive into over the course of the next couple of weeks as we kind of get into training camp and beyond. In the meantime, make sure you join subtext.com/LockedOnNets. Let's keep the Nets conversation going, baby. Text messages all day long about your Brooklyn Nets. And make sure you subscribe over on YouTube as well. Best way to help the show.
I truly believe in positive synergy, that your positive mindset gives you a more hopeful outlook, and belief that you can do something great means you will do something great. Why, that's Russell Wilson.
Oh, almost RIP with this guy. And one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball. End of career basketball. Yeah.